and welcome to Realized webinar on the 1031 exchange, a systematic wealth management tool. I'm Drew Reynolds with Realized, and your host today is going to be our senior real estate analyst, Colton Hosinger. Before we get too far along, as always, I need to cover a few disclosures. Realized does not provide tax or legal advice. This is not a recommendation to buy or sell any security. Also, we will be touching on Delaware statutory trust investments, which are structured as securities. Delaware statutory trust, or DSTs, are offered through private placements. They are considered highly illiquid and may lose some or all of their value. Please refer to the underlying offering documents of a specific investment for a more comprehensive disclosure of risk. Statements made in this presentation regarding securities and tax are for illustrative purposes only. An individual situation may vary. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Colton. Take it away, Colton.
Thanks, Drew. So today, this presentation is meant to provide a high-level overview on 1031 exchanges and how it can be utilized to manage capital gain tax liability. We will not be taking a deep dive in the tax code. We'll start with an overview of Realized's general philosophy. From there, we'll move to the reason most of you are listening today, which will be an overview on 1031 exchanges, covering timing, requirements, and how it can be utilized to manage one's capital gain tax liability over time. We'll be moving at a quick pace, so think of today as a 1031 exchange 101. If there are certain points of interest along the way, it's likely we have additional resources that include more detailed webinars, ebooks, and blog articles. We're also happy to speak to your advisor one-on-one if need be. So first, what does Realized do? Realized is an investment property wealth management firm providing holistic solutions incorporating real estate that we believe have quantifiable tax benefits to investors. Frequently, this means working with an individual advisor or 1031 exchange investor working on planning and reinvestment options. 1031s can be a transitional point in someone's life, and investors may not have what they need. We have a referral network of CPAs, financial planners, and attorneys that we love to refer to all of our clients. Our goal is to leave the investor in a better overall situation, whether that be through understanding their tax situation or having reliable legal advice. For capital gains from real estate, Realized seeks to provide solutions to families who have wealth trapped in legacy investment property. It's no secret that America has an aging population. In many instances, direct real estate makes up a high concentration of an individual's net worth, which was great for building wealth, but very rare that the holdings were acquired as part of a cohesive investment strategy. For example, I'm sure many of you can relate to owning a former primary residence or former business property, maybe inheriting the family farm or owning rental homes. And this is all great up until the point in someone's life where managing real estate could be interfering with lifestyle objectives. Even with a property manager, I think most of the property owners will tell you that it's still fairly involved. Then there's changing family dynamics. I think the investor is getting older, their real estate holdings may or may not be where they currently live or where they want to live, and their children may or may not want to do anything with their assets. And then there's the risk factor, which we believe is too often overlooked with risk in real estate is hard to quantify. But let's break it down. First, there is volatility. In a common case, the rental home an investor owns is either 100% occupied or 100% vacant. It's the difference between making money and losing money for the year. They'll throw in capital exposure. Investment property owners are often a water heater replacement away from zero cash flow for the year. Maintenance and out-of-pocket costs are, as the client is getting older, is not ideal. And then there's lack of diversification. Depending on a study you read, something like 70% of investment properties owned within 15 miles of where the investor lives. It tends to be very concentrated in one property type. I'm sure we all know someone who owns 4 rental homes within a 5-mile radius of their primary residence. The issue we see is that everyone hits a transitional point in their life. Getting older, moving from a growth phase to an income phase of investment, thinking about estate planning, they need help, and yet we see that there's not many resources to provide what they need. Real estate brokers may or may not understand wealth management. To brokers, real estate is transactional and local. They may not be trained in portfolio management. They may not be privy to an investor's overall financial situation objectives either. Wealth managers, on the other hand, may not understand investment real estate. It doesn't fit their traditional model. They may understand REITs, but we feel they are rarely well-versed in direct real estate. So for all these reasons, an investor may feel trapped. They no longer have the desire to actively manage property. The children aren't real interested in owning or managing the investment, which may create family tension, The investor is beginning to focus more on risk mitigation. And yet, if they sell, the capital gains tax burden can erode a meaningful percentage of their net worth that they worked so hard to create. So what's a potential solution? In our view, it's an end-to-end program that seeks to help investors transition from managing real estate to managing wealth. And how is that done? I'll speak to the specific tools in a second, but at a high level, it means utilizing provisions of the tax code to your advantage. It means moving from a concentrated and localized position to a diversified portfolio of quality real estate investments. And it means potentially adding liquidity and divisibility options to a traditionally illiquid and non-divisible asset class, all while seeking to defer and potentially eliminate capital gains exposure. Very quickly before we tackle the specifics, who is Realize and how are we able to help? As a firm, Realize has a wide combination of experience. Team members come from deep real estate backgrounds, including experience in virtually every facet of institutional real estate. Realize also has experience whose management has direct experience working as a DST sponsor at a prior firm. You can see the highlights on your screen. Our goal is to marry real estate knowledge with best practices in the wealth management field. And why is that so important is that most of the strategies we'll be touching on today, despite being real estate related, are actually offered at securities and thus typically offered through securities reps who may or may not be well versed in real estate. Today, it is important to recognize that Realize is not a sponsor. Realize only acts as a client-centric advisor to avoid any conflicts of interest. And we focus on a relatively narrow niche, which is tax-efficient real estate investment vehicles. So let's begin our conversation around 1031 exchanges. Most of you are probably generally familiar with 1031 exchanges. They have been around since 1921 and allow investors to defer, although not eliminate, depreciation recapture and capital gains tax liabilities, so long as they reinvest in one or more investment property, subject to a host of rules and requirements. This is somewhat similar to a 401k in that wealth builds on a tax-deferred basis. Deferring taxes is designed to allow investors to keep more of their money at work for them. So what is eligible for a 1031 exchange? According to the IRS, it is real property that is held for investment, trade, or business purposes under Section 1031. Further, the property being exchanged into, also called a replacement property, must be like kind, which is generally broad in nature. Properties do not need to be the same type. For example, raw land can be exchanged for an office building, a warehouse can be exchanged for a retail property, or a single-family rental can be exchanged into syndicated investments that are considered the same as direct property by the IRS. Two structures include the Delaware Statutory Trust and the tenant common structure. Further, properties can be located anywhere in the U.S., which includes its territories. And lastly, exchanges are not limited to one property. An individual can go from multiple assets into one asset or vice versa. So there are really four types of exchanges that investors can really use. The first one we're going to cover is the delayed exchange, which is the most popular amongst investors. In the delayed exchange, property is sold and replacement property is purchased within 180 days, identified within 45 days. Due to the long timeline, this tends to be the most popular strategy, like I said, amongst investors. And then there's the simultaneous exchange, where the original property is sold and the replacement property is purchased on the same day. Logistically, this strategy can be difficult due to its tight timing window, especially when properties are located in different states or there's multiple properties involved. In a reverse exchange, the replacement property is acquired before the original property is sold. This can be a viable option when the exchanger must close on the replacement property before a buyer has been found on the relinquished property. And then lastly, there's the improvement exchange, where the exchange proceeds may be used to acquire and improve upon the replacement property. Tax deferral in this strategy is dependent on the acquisition price of the replacement property along with the cost of improvements. So what are the basics of a 1031 delayed exchange? So first off, it's restricted to real estate, similar to the other types. Taxes are deferred, meaning there's no elimination of capital gains. This deferral can be rolled indefinitely. In delayed 1031 exchange, there are very real timing constraints on identification and reinvestment, which we will cover more in depth. You must also invest all of your proceeds, meaning you match the equity and debt values of the relinquished property. And then there are estate planning considerations. Upon the death of the taxpayer executing one or more exchanges, the taxpayer's heirs will receive a step-up on basis to the property's fair market value. So let's talk about timing constraints. The good news is that they are very straightforward. The bad news is that they're not really long. Investors are subject to 45 days to identify replacement properties and a total of 180 days to complete the purchase. The 180-day closing requirement is usually not the issue. The issue is finding the Goldilocks property, the one an investor would actually want to own, not just for capital gains deferment, and feeling confident about their ability to close on that property. Anyone who's ever bought investment real estate will tell you that closing is never a sure thing. As mentioned, taxpayers have 45 days to identify their replacement options. To the IRS, there's 3 different strategies that one can utilize. The first one is going to be the 3-property rule. Under the 3-property rule, an investor can identify up to 3 replacement options with the option to acquire 1 or more of those properties. Secondly, you have the 200% rule. In the 200% rule, an investor can identify any number of replacement options so long as their combined value, factoring equity and debt, doesn't exceed 200% of the sell price of the relinquished property. And then lastly, we have the 95% rule. In the 95% rule, an investor can identify any number of replacement properties provided that the taxpayer acquires 95% of what's identified. This strategy is considered to be the most risky of the 3 strategies because the investor's entire exchange can be compromised if 1 or more of the properties can't be closed on. In regard to reinvestment requirements, there are a couple of rules to follow. First, taxpayers must acquire equal or greater property value, and the value of the debt must be equal to or greater than the debt in the relinquished property. In other words, one must invest all of their 1031 exchange equity and match the debt on their relinquished property in order to fully defer their capital gain tax liability. As a note, bringing in additional equity can help offset debt, but taking on additional debt does not offset equity. Also, some closing costs can be paid with exchange proceeds, which lowers the equity reinvestment requirement. These must be routine selling expenses or expenses that would typically show up in any real estate transaction, financed or not. This includes broker commissions, exchange fees, title insurance fees, escrow fees, transfer fees, and attorney's fees. Non-eligible expenses include loan fees, security deposits, prorated rents, and prorated property taxes. So let's discuss 1031 exchange advantages and considerations. So why would someone utilize a 1031 exchange? Again, similar to a 401k, a 1031 exchange is designed to allow investors to defer capital gains taxes in reinvesting in investment properties. A 1031 exchange can help maximize equity available for reinvestment, potentially resulting in significantly higher cash flow and wealth accumulation compared to paying taxes. You can see on the graph here the impact of paying taxes at each sale. Mathematically, it's not much different than taking a large loss. If you're paying substantial amounts of taxes at each sale, that may result in needing a very large increase in value just to get back to break even where you were before paying taxes. And because you are sheltering yourself from loss that will result from paying taxes, more equity may be available to roll into the next investment. Take the hypothetical example in this slide. Given the investor has a relatively large capital gain tax liability, if they didn't execute a 1031 exchange, the difference in annual distribution would be significant if they decided to pay taxes and invest in another asset with equal potential average rate of return. So we just saw that 1031 exchange can be a powerful wealth building tool. So why doesn't everyone selling an investment property do a 1031 exchange? Well, the IRS isn't going to make it easy. In short, you have relatively large transactions over a short period of time involving a meaningful percentage of one's net worth, requiring a skill set to realize things few real estate investors possess and a resource commitment they would rather not make. For starters, the average investor may not be in the market day in and day out. So it can be a steep learning curve in a short period of time to understand market dynamics such as valuations, rental rates, and financing. While it's a little out of the scope of this discussion, a major hurdle we see is that investors need to find that Goldilocks property. In order to fully defer taxes, investors must spend all of their equity and buy equal or greater property value, which may be difficult to achieve. From a practical standpoint, this means replacing or increasing the debt they just paid off. So the choices are not great. Either increase risk by taking on more debt or acquire property in very close price range to what was just relinquished. And in terms of pursuing lifestyle objectives, these might not align. Which leads us to the question, what is a Delaware Statutory Trust, or DST for short? Despite its name, DSTs have nothing to do with Delaware other than where the trust is filed. A DST is similar to a family trust where the investor names the heirs as beneficiaries. Here, the DST owns the property and the investors are beneficiaries to that trust. The IRS has formally recognized this structure as 1031 exchange compliant since 2004. In short, the DST structure is what allows us to pursue a wealth management approach to portfolio construction. They are pre-packaged investments. The sponsor acquires the property with a loan already in place and due diligence is already complete. This leads to low execution or transaction risk. Investors simply acquire pieces of existing equity in the DST and can close in a matter of days. DSTs offer 1031 exchange eligibility both in and out of the investment. This is important to understand. Other co-ownership structures do not qualify. LLCs, partnerships, corporations, etc. do not work unless the entire entity does the 1031 exchange. DSTs are one of the only legal entities that allow co-investment but still allow individual optionality on exit. In our experience, DSTs tend to feature stabilized properties and offer the same income tax shelters as direct property, including mortgage interest deductions and depreciation deductions. The property can be the same scale and types of assets owned by REITs, pension funds, and insurance companies. The investments are 100% passive, and DSTs offer all the same liability protections of an LLC and then some. There's no liability based on the property or other investors. There's usually non-recourse debt in place and no capital calls. DSTs can accommodate virtually any dollar amount, allowing exchanges to be tied to an individual's needs. The best part about DSTs is that diversification is achievable as well. A DST can own multiple properties, or an investor can own multiple DSTs. So for example, an investor with $500,000 can invest $100,000 in a DST owning a 300-unit apartment community in Tampa, a $200K investment in an Amazon distribution facility, and then another $200,000 in a medical office portfolio located throughout the United States. In conclusion, DSTs are a way to achieve both scale and diversification in one's portfolio with little to no execution risk. We've covered a lot today, and thank you for joining me as we discuss the basics of the 1031 exchange. Many of you have submitted questions in advance, and I'd like to thank you for doing so. We will be sharing your questions with our investment consultant team so that they are prepared to address these with you in a more intimate setting. Over the next few days, you will be receiving follow-ups from our team, as well as a link to the recording from today. In the meantime, we invite you to register and view our online marketplace of investment opportunities. The link is on the screen and will be in our follow-up emails. Thanks again. I hope you found this helpful and informative to your investment decision-making process. Now at this time, our Chief Investment Officer, Drew Reynolds, will answer some questions that were submitted by viewers.
Excellent. Thank you, Colton. That was a very good overview of the 1031 exchange. And as you mentioned, I'd like to thank all the listeners for the questions that were submitted in advance. We actually received quite a few questions, so as Colton mentioned, we may need to consolidate some and get them over to the investors after the fact. And fortunately, Colton did an excellent job in covering the vast majority of questions that were asked. So I will now, I guess, dive into here some of the open questions that we received that were maybe a little out of the general scope of the discussion. But before I do, I'd just like to remind everybody with the similar disclosures that were mentioned up top is that Realize does not provide tax, legal, or investment advice, and that also in addressing some of these questions that there are facts and circumstances that need to be taken into account. So in short, when answering these questions, they're really, I'm answering these in generalities and that your specific situation may differ accordingly. So I'm going to start with questions that were more general in nature, and then we'll move on down to questions that were, I guess, increasingly specific in the ask. So first question, would you recommend DST, individual purchase, or joint group with multiple properties? I'll start on the tail end of that question, then work backwards. So the first part regarding joining a group, And I think Colton touched on this earlier, but you do need to be very mindful here. As Colton mentioned, there's really only two legal structures that allow 1031 that are 1031 compliant for previously unrelated entities, and that's the DST and the tenant in common. And so it's very important to note that things like an LLC or partnership are generally not 1031 eligible. So before you look into doing a deal with friends or colleagues or somebody be mindful of the legal structure. You definitely want to get legal advice there. Regarding the question on DST versus direct property, without knowing your direct situation, this is not something that can be answered easily. I think with all investments in general, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There is no perfect answers. It really comes down to a variety of things. I think the realized process starts with helping investors think through all those, including what's your tax liability first and foremost. There's times where it makes sense just to pay taxes rather than invest at all. You also need to consider risk tolerance, other holdings, estate planning, so on and so forth. So I think that the takeaway here is there's not a cut and dry answer, but for those who are interested, the realized process starts with just helping investors walk through all of those questions, whether or not we're able to help you or not. Hopefully you're able to come away from the situation feeling more informed or at least educated on options that may be available to you. Next question. I'm particularly interested in the detail of how to transition my current real estate portfolio into something my family can more easily manage. I'm currently a full-time landlord maintaining several rentals, but interested in moving into a passive position that can be more easily managed by my spouse or the heirs to my estate. Ideally, something with a degree of liquidity for estate planning purposes. Well, fortunately, you've come to the right place. That's really exactly what Realize does, as Colton managed up front. It's a investment property wealth management process focusing on helping investors transition. We brought up earlier that transitional point in your life, but unfortunately not a lot of resources to do so. The details, both because of kind of the in-depth nature that we need to go into from the understanding someone's financial perspective, as well as some of the securities issues that are involved, make it difficult to cover in a Q&A session, but happy to do that on a one-on-one basis. I will say that the Realize process in general, as Colton mentioned, it involves utilizing the tax code provisions to your advantage. It frequently, although not always, means moving from a concentrated and localized position into a diversified portfolio of larger scale professionally managed assets. It frequently means exploring potential liquidity and divisibility options for those estate planning needs, and all this while making sure, of course, that the capital gains are fully deferred. Again, because of both the individual situations and the securities components, that's going to be beyond the scope of what we can cover here, but please reach out to an investment consultant, I realized, and we'll cover that in more detail. Next question. I have a investment property selling soon and need to decide what to do with the money. My tax liability will be around $30,000. I'd like to roll the entire amount into a rental property, but don't want to have $500,000 tied up in a single rental. Get this question a lot. My ideal situation would be to take the entire $140,000 in capital gains plus equity and pay cash for a new rental, but that does not fit the 1031 rules. There's multiple points to this question, so I'm going to break them down. As Colton mentioned during the requirements for balancing exchange, it's actually a bit of a misconception. From a practical standpoint, typically you need to offset the replaced debt with debt, but that is not a legal requirement. The rules are you simply need to reinvest all your net equity proceeds and buy equal or greater property value. So it is always possible to buy down that replacement with bringing in additional equity. So in that case, with the 500,000 example, and call it 140 of cash, if you really wanted, you could bring in $360,000 of cash, buy something on an all-cash basis, and it would qualify for exchange purposes. And it doesn't need to be all or none either. You could buy down part of it, etc. part two of that question is there a way that I can do this without carrying a $360,000 loan? Yes, in addition to bringing in the outside cash, which I just mentioned, it's also, you may, depending on your situation and if you are deemed an accredited investor, may want to consider a DST option, which Colton touched on earlier, that has non-recourse debt available. So although you would still have allocated debt, it would be non-recourse, and additionally you would not have to go through the loan approval process or securing the loan yourself. It would already be placed on the property. Again, important to understand the details behind there. Perhaps a qualified opportunity zone investment. This is still part of the same question. QOZs were beyond the scope of this discussion. We do have additional resources for those who are interested. I will say that it is possible to do so, although it gets tricky when there's debt involved because you have to reinvest the gains, which is not necessarily the profits. It's the difference between the sale price and the adjusted basis. I think a bigger takeaway, though, is understanding the differences between a 1031 exchange and a QOZ investment. They are very different, although they both defer taxes, and with QOZ potentially eliminate taxes and have a heavy real estate component. The overall investment structure is quite different. Again, we have a few webinars on this, one looking at DSTs and QOZs, another with a more in-depth QOZ discussion, or happy to speak to you one-on-one. Next question, in a low inventory market, if you identify 3 to 5 properties within 45 days and closing on those 3 to 5 properties gets bought out from under you, what are the penalties? Realizing you have 180 days to distribute all of the proceeds in the 1031 exchange, can you identify and close without penalty on another property not identified in the original 45-day window? No, that is a hard no. As Colton mentioned, you have 45 days to identify. On day 45, you're going to list the potential replacement properties with your qualified intermediary. That list cannot change. If the properties are sold out from under you, that's unfortunate, but that's the reality. For this reason, I think from a practical standpoint, it's important, especially in today's market, to get out in front of things in terms of a financial planning and what you're going to do on the other side. Without knowing more about the individual's overall situation, I can't opine as to whether or not a DST could be a suitable option or a suitable backup option. But I will say that one reason we see investors consider DSTs either for primary or backup options is because of that pre-packaged nature that was mentioned in the presentation, and the lower execution risk. You know, you're not having to go through negotiations and tie up things. Again, really comes down to case by case, but the takeaway is no, you cannot alter that, what's been identified. Next question, what are the pros and cons of the secondary market for DST investments for the seller and buyer? This was not explicitly touched on in the presentation, but yes, it is possible to sell or buy DST interest prior to the sale of the underlying property. And again, there's a lot of resources that are out there on the website for you, or we can talk through this with others. From the seller's standpoint, I'd say the advantages would be potential liquidity to an otherwise illiquid investment. Generally, DSTs are longer-term hold-in periods. This may potentially allow investors an earlier exit than is contemplated by the sponsor. They're also divisible, so you don't necessarily need to sell all of a position. We did one recently, I think it was a $600,000 position where the investor peeled off $400,000 and retained $200,000. That's all perfectly fine. It does give investors the opportunity to potentially rebalance a portfolio, selling part and then moving in to another part. And that's due in part that the DST, the interests themselves are 1031 exchange eligible, meaning even though the property of the DST has not sold, it is possible to do a 1031 into or out of secondary position. The cons for the seller, I would say they typically trade at a discount to the intrinsic value for the liquidity premium. So there may be cases where that interest would be worth more if you held it to maturity than if you're selling earlier. but it really depends on the specifics, and without knowing the specific deal, can't opine on that too much. The other con is finding the right size buyer. Different than in a primary market DST, there's typically a large block of equity that's available, and as Colton mentioned, therefore possible to size virtually any size investment. You know, if you've got some odd dollar amount, the DST can handle that. In a secondary, there's only a finite amount of equity available, so it's got to be the, you know, kind of right size seller to right size buyer. On the buy side, advantages would be visibility into an actual performance of an offering as opposed to just basing things on projections. The flip side of potentially selling at a discount to the intrinsic value is there may be a potentially higher return to a secondary position relative to the closest comparable primary offering. And because the offering has been out, or the term we'd use is seasoned, for a few years, it's also potential that there'd be an anticipated shorter holding period, which could be a benefit to some. The cons are the other side of the equation there is finding the right size investment. You know, for sellers who are looking to sell, oftentimes they don't want to be stuck with the dregs. So for instance, you had $180,000 to spend, it's a $200,000 position. The seller may not want to be stuck with, you know, $20,000 of a position left over, by way of example. Next question, we sold one residential property and are replacing it with two residential properties. How do I record that? All 1031 exchanges are recorded on IRS Form 8824, specifically in Section 3. There are lines to list the value of the relinquished properties and the replacement properties. You basically just fill out the value of properties sold and the value of properties acquired. As always, we'd recommend that you consult with the CPA, and if you don't have one, happy to point you in the right direction. Next question, can undeveloped land, when used for a 1031 exchange, later be developed without penalty taxes being charged upon the sale of the land? I would recommend talking to an accountant and attorney on this. The answer is it depends. So the way that the regulations generally read is that for a 1031 eligibility needs to be, a property needs to be held for investment purposes. And I think the distinction here, it would be the distinction between, say, a developer who is subdividing lots and then, you know, like a residential subdivision, that could be construed as inventory, and inventory is generally not 1031 exchange eligible. So there's a lot of facts and circumstances here, so this one definitely want to consult attorney or tax advisor prior to doing going down that path. Next one, I rented out a former residence. In January, I'll have rented out for 3 years out of the last 5. Can I do a 1031 exchange and still keep my $500,000 federal deduction? Short answer is yes, but there's some planning and rules that you may need to be aware of. I think you're referring to the homestead exemption, which is $250,000 for single filers, $500,000 for married. Assuming you properly converted your primary residence, you could be eligible for both the primary home exclusion and a 1031 exchange with the balance. Again, please consult your CPA. There are several rules around what needs to be done in order to have properly documented this and established it as a rental property, and then there's some carve-out exclusions too that are beyond this. Short answer, yes. Longer answer is please consult your attorney or CPA. Next question, I have a rental house in Wyoming, which I would like to sell and buy another rental house in Oregon for my daughter. After 2 years upon death, I would like for her to own the house. Again, need to be careful here. Under current tax law, upon death, your heirs would receive a step-up in basis, subject to certain limitations. That is on the chopping block under the Biden proposal, so tough to say how that's going to plan out. If you're assuming you're still living, you may want to consult an estate planning specialist. There may be other strategies that could accomplish the same goal here. Part B of that question is, can her name be placed on the deed or the mortgage at the time of purchase? Again, need to be really careful here. Generally, no. Generally, 1031 exchanges must follow the same taxpayer provision, meaning the same party that sold a property must be the same party that bought a property, so that could be construed as a change in entity. Again, I consult your attorney. There's some questions here about renting to the daughter in that same transaction. Again, you need to be very careful. There are some rules around related party transactions. As I understand it, it may be possible to do so provided it is a market rate rent and not some, friends and family discount. Again, you're going to want to speak to, an attorney before you do this, as there's a lot of gray area here and potentially jeopardizing the 1031 exchange. Last question here is, I want to buy a rental house in Portugal or Italy and have a rental in California to sell. Any way I can make this work is a 1031. Unfortunately, no. Generally speaking, it is domestic property for domestic property, or if you're a U.S. resident, foreign property for foreign property, meaning if you had something in Portugal, you could sell it and reinvest, exchange into something in Italy. However, that would only defer the U.S. tax component of the exchange, and so be liable for taxes in those countries as applicable. I'm certainly no expert in foreign taxation, but again, that's something you want to tread very carefully on. There is potentially opening yourself to a whole host of issues. So there's a few others. We'll clean these up. We'll get the Q&A out to all the investors that are on this call. Thanks again to all the investors and listeners that were on the line today. I hope you came away with this a little bit more informed. And if you have questions, I know we covered a lot here today, both in the presentation and the Q&A. Please either give a call to one of our investment property wealth management professionals or email us at answers@realized1031.com. And with that, thank you all again for your time, and we'll see you again here hopefully in a few weeks.